Welcome everyone to our live consultation with Dr. Scott Miller. Scott is here to answer your questions about My Outcomes Advanced Behavioral Algorithms and Reporting Features and how the new algorithms will change the way you look and think about session and service target reporting. My Outcomes version 14 includes important changes to benchmarking and reporting features. The most impactful changes with this release are the move from an expected treatment response based on average client progress to a more predictive success, non-success model. Scott is going to be joining me a minute to talk a little bit more about that, but first I'm going to familiarize you with the changes you will see in the system when we go live this Friday night. This is the scatter plot. This is a new reporting feature where clinicians can see their entire client's status on one graph with a red, yellow, or green dot for each client displayed on the scatter plot, and when you roll over the dot, it will show you the client ID. On the graph, we have a new update past session feature that allows us to include a note. So you can make a note about a session and have it appear when you roll over the session score on the graph. And on the provider homepage, we have now added skip a session, so it can be accessed simply from here. And there's been a number of changes made to the aggregate stats page. Average raw change, average session change, and average service change have all been removed as an individual reliable change index is computed for each client, which is basically the service target, the change between the intake score and the service target. It's roughly, but much more accurate measure. Average intake SRS. This is a new feature that indicates whether the therapist is able to elicit the feedback needed to improve engagement. So ideally, at intake, we want to see an SRS that's coming in below the 36 clinical cutoff. Corrected effect size and session effect size have also been changed to relative effect size. And Scott's going to talk a little bit more about that. Percent of clients reaching service target. You're also going to see that definition has changed to the percentage of clients scoring in the green zone, which represent the successful outcomes. So then next we have the dashboard. And on the dashboard, we have gotten rid of 10% below as this is no longer relevant in the new system because the red scores are predictive of clients who will end treatment unsuccessfully. And so the red hand, which used to be the red score, has now also been replaced with off track, and yellow is now replaced with at risk. Additionally, there have been changes to the feedback system. It's now it's much simpler than the old system. When the score is below this bottom regression line, it's going to be coded red, and if it's in between in this yellow zone, it's yellow, and if it's above, it's green. All right, so now I would like to bring Scott on and talk with Scott a little bit about some of these changes. And then after, so Scott's going to kind of explain a little bit more about what you're seeing here on the graph, comparing the old expected treatment response to the new, talking about some of these changes. And then we're going to go into a Q&A session where we're going to, I'm going to give some of the questions that we've received and some of the feedback we've received from some of our super users. And then we'll be taking questions from our attendees. And so if you have a question, You can just go ahead and put that in the chat section. All right, so Scott, thanks for joining us. Exciting times. I know it's a little bit nervous for people because, you know, we've taken some things away and we've made some changes.
Well, but I think that, as you're pointing out, Cindy, the interface is much cleaner, the messages are much more direct, and I can also say that they are much more empirically robust than they have been in the past. It's not that what we had back then was bad or wrong, it was cutting edge at the time, but we're moving on from the Ford Pinto to the Cadillac or Mercedes-Benz predictive algorithms.
That's great, that's great. So can you, I think it would be really good if you could just elaborate a little bit more, Scott. So, you know, people are used to seeing this expected treatment response and, you know, this range. And I think this is one of the things that's really going to cause confusion. And I know I sent you some of the feedback from our super users, you know, like, if you could just explain a little bit more about the differences and how they can interpret that.
Well, initially in the algorithms that we produced, and virtually every other person that is developing such algorithms or has developed and promoted various measures of outcome used, were averages. So whenever a client got an initial score, we plotted the median response of clients in the database that had received a similar score. So it was essentially the 50th percentile, and 50% of people scored above that and 50% of people scored below that. It's not unlike what happens if you go to the physician and they say, they might give you some bad news and say something like that, we're sorry, but you have cancer. And one of the first questions you're going to ask if they tell you give you that news is, well, you'll probably ask, well, what are my chances? And then the physician would say something that sounds so good at first glance. It sounds so informative, but as you think about it, it really communicates nothing. They would say something like, well, you have a 68% chance of survival. And you leave the office thinking, oh, 68%. But what you really didn't know was whether you were part of the 68% who lived or the 32% who died, because there is only 100% alive and 100% dead. So plotting the trajectory in this way wasn't really predictive of whether or not you were likely to be in the surviving group, in the group that experienced positive change. The algorithms and predictive algorithms in medicine have improved dramatically. We're borrowing the logic of those algorithms in these by saying that now, since our database is so huge, we have nearly 500,000 cases, completed cases in the database, and we can actually plot client score from session to session and say, is their improvement at this visit more like people who end treatment successfully? So if the client's score is above that green regression line, in the green zone, they are progressing more like people who are likely to end treatment successfully. In the past, all it told you was how you compared to the median response of clients. It didn't tell you if you ended treatment successfully. Here, it's actually giving you instant feedback that this client is on track for a successful outcome at this particular time, or not, as the case may be. If they're in the red zone, of course, then they are moving more like clients who do not end treatment successfully. And if they're in the yellow zone, it's too close to call. The clients are at risk. They're neither going forwards or backwards as far as we can tell. And as in the interview, the client's actual progress, their status, as you call it, Cindy, is plotted in the black line. And for this particular client, we have 4 sessions that are in the yellow zone, 1 that's in the green zone. For 1 session, the client was looking more like people who end successfully. But for 4 visits, this particular client has been progressing like people whose outcome is impossible to determine. It really means that the therapist probably needs to do something different. And a good place to look on the graph that you're showing right now is in the SRS. And that particular trajectory really hasn't changed very much. You're still interpreting that in the same way. And all of the scores for this particular client, with the exception of 1, are below the clinical cutoff of 36. which probably means that there's something wrong in terms of the engagement or relationship with this client that might be leading to suboptimal progress on their part. The green line, just so people know, that solid green line is the minimum amount of change a person needs to make from visit to visit in order to be within the successful group. Whereas last time, all you had was the median response of people. It didn't tell us whether or not people were successful or not. It just told us, on average, what direction people went. And so here you're getting a much more fine-tuned analysis, which has allowed you, at My Outcomes, to make the warnings much simpler. Because if they're in the green zone, they're on track, period. That's it. If they're not in that zone, they're either at risk or they are off track. Does that clarify things a bit, Cindy?
Yeah, that's great, Scott. I'm just going to move now to a before and after of first the outcome rating scale and then the session rating scale.
Yeah. So
on the result rating scale before, Scott's helped us understand the differences here. We've also made changes. We've got rid of the feedback messages and we've changed the signals. So I'm just going to take you. So this is what the new ORS results page looks like. Can you talk a little bit more about the messages and why you thought it was a good idea at this point to get rid of feedback messages? And so the signals we've changed from the hands to just a cleaner yellow, green, or red dot. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Scott?
No, I think, again, initially the hands and the lengthy messages were our attempts over a decade ago to put something useful into the system for for therapists to think about when the cases might be off track, when the client wasn't responding like the average client in the system. But now, having people that are experienced with using the tools, if they see that the SRS scores are below the clinical cutoff, they know by definition that this is an area where they should be focused. And so that kind of detailed worded messages really aren't necessary. In addition, we've noticed that simply alerting therapists, simply saying, look, the client is in the yellow zone, the caution zone, enables most of those therapists to start talking with their clients about why that might be and what they might do, both the client and the therapist, to facilitate more change, more reliable change, more change predictive of people that end treatment successfully. So I think the words, in a way, at this point, get in the way. Simply giving people the signals tells them instantly they either need to slow down, yellow, caution, pay attention, green, keep going, and red, you need to really stop and take a hard look at this.
I think something you said that I think is key here, Scott, is you said people more familiar with the system, and of course there's new users coming onto the system all the time, but I think really what it is over the years what has been learned is a lot more education is required, and so that today clinicians are in the system, they've got more understanding of what these measures mean, and they can, we're hoping they have the ability to clinically interpret it themselves as opposed to us giving them that information before, when we just didn't have, wasn't the same kind of training available and resources as today.
Not as widespread, and of course, you have the e-learning system that's associated with My Outcomes that people can go to when they first start. I think the got about the messages were that they weren't exactly quite right for the individual therapist, or that they were found to be annoying, etc. And again, for us, this was just our first attempt to try to download our brains at that time about what we would think about when the client scores weren't like the average client. Now we're saying that the client scores are, in fact, predictive of either success or failure. So when you get a yellow, you know that that client is at risk for a negative outcome unless you do something. Next line for me, or a way to think about that, is to move up and look at the problem in the relationship. But that's not the only area that clinicians might consider changing. So it was just one suggestion, and I think with the simpler interface, it gives clinicians a snapshot. It goes together so nicely with the scatter plot, the idea that you can simply look and get an instant picture of whether your particular client is on track and how your clients overall are faring, on track, at risk, or off track. All of those things are designed to make the process of getting and using the feedback much more simple. This scatter plot, for example, Cindy, I just think it's fabulous. It looks great. It gives you that instant snapshot of how many clients you're seeing, at what numbers of sessions, and whether or not, and which clients you really need to attend to. So in this particular scatter plot, I can see that a little over half, if this were my caseload, a little over half of my clients I need attention to. I need to click and hover over those yellow dots, find out who the red dots are, especially at session 10 and session 13. These are folks that I've seen for a significant chunk of time, and still they are at risk or on track for a negative outcome. It's such a nice, clear picture of where things are at overall on my caseload. And it's not wordy. The visual impact, I think, is simple, but also strong.
For me, the visual impact of this message, particularly to the client, I mean, these signals are, people have complained the signals themselves, right, are, can be off-putting. And this is just, it provides the information without, big alarm bells going off. So yeah, I think it is. It's just it's a cleaner, simpler look, and cleaner and simpler is always better. Okay, let me just. Is there anything else on these results pages that we should talk about? Certainly, people can ask questions if they want to know more. So Scott, let's get into some of the questions from our super users. So when super users, if you're wondering who they are is everybody, when I sent out the notice about this webinar coming up and the changes we were making, everybody who contacted me, as well as some people who are I just regularly rely on, all of those people were given the opportunity to complete a super user feedback form that went through all of the different changes that we've made, and basically getting their opinion on them and asking, what makes clinical sense, and also, what are your concerns, so that we can, make sure that we are addressing those today. So Scott, let me just have a look here. So the first question is in regards to average raw change, average session change, and average service change. They've all been removed. People don't like it when we remove things. So the feedback is, I was just talking to our therapists in training yesterday, and this is one stat that is super simple that they can understand. Please don't remove it. Scott, can you talk a little bit about why we don't think we need to, we don't want people really looking at those anymore, and what that can do?
You mean like average raw change?
Average raw change, exactly.
The truth is that a lot of this was an experiment. We were throwing lots up on the wall and seeing what stuck and if it made sense. And knowing how much change on average your clients experience doesn't really tell you anything, because initially we were using something called the reliable change index to indicate whether or not clients were at risk or not. And that reliable change index, there was some debate over how much it was, how large it was, or how small it was. But the point is that an average doesn't really inform the individual case. If we said the average shoe size in the US were a size 9, and then we made everybody wear that, that would be problematic. And that's essentially what we were doing in the system, because we didn't have enough cases to be able to make individual reliable change estimates. It's a pretty significant change. So instead of saying everybody has a size 9 shoe, and if they fit, it's great. If not, well, that's a problem for them. Now what we're saying is we can determine exactly what a person's shoe size is for a successful psychotherapy. We can tell how many points they need to change specifically in order for that score to predict a successful outcome from session to session and ultimately at the end. That's that bottom green solid regression line. And if the client is at or above that, then they are achieving the amount of change necessary to be successful by the end of care. And so knowing how many points people change on average raw score, the old idea was that the reliable change index was 5, and so if you were at or about 5, that must be a good thing. But that's not necessarily a good thing. If you're dealing with lots of clients that are scoring in the low teens, that number is actually low. It's not high. So it ended up not really giving the kind of accurate information that clinicians need to know if they're on track or off track. And the truth is, most of us, me included, we want to know, are we on track? Yeah. And what we really should be interested in, and we can talk about this a bit later for deliberate practice purposes, is when we are off track. And this tells you that instantly. You have a red signal for a client in your scatter plot. Your client's status from session to session, that big thick black line on the graph in front of you, is in the red zone, then your clients are off track, and you don't really need to know that average amount of raw change.
Thanks, Scott. That's good. That's good. You just mentioned deliberate practice, so that's good because the next question is in regards to the average intake SRS, and so the feedback is great addition for deliberate practice. Can you elaborate on that?
I sure can, and this is one thing that I think was a really good addition, and it may seem like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth since I just said, well, averages aren't good, and yet we're reporting an average. But here's what we do know about average intake scores on the SRS. So at your very first session, lower SRS scores actually are correlated with better outcomes. So if you have a crew or you're individually always getting an average intake SRS of 39 or 40, you probably need to work on, that is deliberately practice, getting more negative feedback from your clients. Because, as I say, improving SRS scores are associated with much better outcomes, about 50% better outcomes. If we can fine-tune the work we're doing. How do we fine-tune? We find out where we're not tuned in to the particular client, and we have to do that early. We also know that scores that start high on the SRS and decline over time are put clients at risk for both dropout and much poorer outcomes, about 7 times less of an effect size when the SRS scores are declining over time rather than improving over time. And this is an area that, for me, that's become a big part of what I'm doing in workshops and in consultations, helping therapists formulate questions and create a culture in the room with clients that allows them to complain about very small things that, when improved, lead those SRS scores to improve over time. We assume that we are good at soliciting negative information, but we're really not. And most of us who start using the SRS actually end up with scores that are too high. So it is an area where we can really take some time to reflect, practice, and create new questions, especially for use in that initial session, to make sure that we're getting the kind of negative feedback we need to fine-tune and tailor the treatment to the individual client.
Yeah, and it's so key. You know, so often people who think that they get this are still coming and saying, you know, look, I've got high SRS scores. What's going on with this person? Right? They you know, seeing it as like a patient satisfaction survey and wanting to get those high scores, and not getting that whole idea about the power of eliciting feedback.
That's
okay.
Right. It's the same thing with management, let me just say, that oftentimes managers who aren't therapists also get the wrong idea about the SRS. They treat it, as you call it, as a satisfaction tool, and they want all of the clients to score high. It's exactly the wrong idea.
Okay. The next one is also related to deliberate practice, and this was somebody was really upset with me because the super users were in a beta site where they started at the administrative level, and not all of the features were turned on at the owner level. You may know, Scott, you can now customize the name of your report, as well as which reporting features you want to show. And so the patient dropouts. So on the aggregate stats page, I'm not going to bother going back to it because it's so small you can't see it. On the aggregate stats page, it now shows why clients leave service, and also the dropout, your dropout rate. So the comment was, what happened to tracking patient dropouts? We were just getting ready to start tracking our patient dropout rates. This is one stat I was trying to figure out how to get clinicians working on from a deliberate practice improvement of skills focus. Without this stat, it really undermines understanding one's actual effectiveness. So how does looking at dropout rates, how does that affect your when you look at your pre-post effect size, for example, and how is that related to deliberate practice?
Well, let's talk about the effect size. I mean, the simplest way to think about this is if you really want to improve your effect size, well, then just terminate all your clients at 2 sessions. Because generally, simply by regression to the mean, you have a substantial amount of clients that improve between the first and the second session. The real challenge is to help people, of course, maintain that change. And we know that people, after they've experienced progress, as you can even see on most of these regression lines, the green line that you're showing, for example, right now, I would say was about 90% of the change in that graph happens by the 4th visit. After the 4th visit, as you can see, the green zone improves very little after that. But the critical piece here is that if you can keep clients a few more visits, the changes are by definition more durable. After all, you've seen them for a longer period of time. And so I would say that when clients drop out, for example, if this client dropped out at session 3, it would look like a success, when in fact the changes weren't maintained over time, and the change between sessions 2 and 3 on the graph were so abrupt, so large, that you would probably assume it had to do with something external rather than a change that resulting from the treatment, especially given the 2 prior sessions of relative lack of change. So what in terms of deliberate practice it means is taking the time to reflect on what you have to do to, number one, keep clients engaged for a little bit longer. And that means practicing having conversations with people who are at risk for dropping out. How do we know they're at risk for dropping out? Declining SRS scores is one example. Number 2, the rapid increase in ORS scores in the first handful of visits. So if you go from a 12 to a 28 or a 30, that client, believe it or not, is at a heightened risk for dropping out. After all, they feel so much better compared to where they started. And encouraging them to stay in care a little bit longer is one area, as I say, that we can spend some time thinking and deliberately practicing, and then notice whether or not what we do with the client in the room has an impact on our dropout rate. Did I get the question?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Thanks, Scott. And it reminds me, I know there's another question coming up here that's related to that, regarding corrected effect size changing to relative effect size. The feedback is, I don't really understand the difference. I assume relative effect size is going to be more accurate. Wondering how this will affect our stats. Will it be going up or down? And if down, how can we provide a rationale for the reported drop in effect size?
Well, of course, all of these statistics depend on the sample that you're compared to. And the corrected effect size means that in the database, we had to do what's called a case mix adjustment. So we were always adjusting your effect size based on the severity of the clients that you saw. Now you're being compared in a slightly different way, and the likelihood is that some people, probably about half of the users, will notice a decline in their relative effect size. And they may notice the same decline in their simple effect size, the uncorrected effect size, as it might be called. And the reason for this is that we have a much larger database to compare you to. And therapists have been using feedback in that database, and guess what? The result is they're getting better. So what is average is increasing. It's sort of the same thing with every measure where we're comparing people. IQ rates, for example, have to constantly be adjusted upward because what is average in that field is on the rise. And so for some folks, given that we have a much larger database, a much more representative database, and because people are using outcomes, which we know improves their effect sizes, the average has begun to climb. That way, for that reason, we have to adjust the comparison that people are getting, and the outcomes are likely, the effect sizes are likely to drop a little bit. Relative effect size is, as the name implies, how are you compared to your relatives? Really, how your other therapists in the sample. And here, the average is 0. You're right at that mean response if you have a 0. And as I say, I'm guessing that about maybe half, maybe slightly less than that of the users will probably notice a decline to 0. Should you be alarmed by that? Heavens no. You shouldn't be alarmed by that, because remember, and as I often say in my workshops, average effects in psychological treatments are on par or better than most medical therapies. So psychotherapy that has average results has an effect size that is roughly equivalent to coronary artery bypass surgery. That's pretty good. So we shouldn't be worried about that.
Okay, thanks, Scott. A question about algorithms. 8-session estimation with the 8 session score being the success score, being the expected service target. So the feedback is not sure how this will hold with trajectories going out to 30 or 40 sessions. So what do you say to people who, you know, they're seeing these clients for a long period of time, and you know, and our service target is based on 8 sessions? And
well, despite the size of the database that we do have, the truth is that after the first session, the numbers, and remember, these aren't based on college students going in a randomized clinical trial. These are based on actually how people attend and use psychotherapy in a broad range of countries and with a broad range of clientele. And for each session that continues, that client continues, the number of people at each session begins to shrink, in part because, of course, naturalistically, some people get better and say goodbye. Other people do not get better and say goodbye. And in addition, there are a smaller and smaller number of people who need slightly longer work in order to achieve an effect. So right now, the tipping point is, as you say, at about the 8th session, where we really have strong, solid predictors of success. If you're seeing a client a little bit longer, that data should be entered into the system, and you should compare it to the expected treatment response, that green line. Over time, we're going to add that data, we'll reanalyze it, and look at how predictive it actually is. So it's not really any different than the prior shortcomings in the prior algorithms. It's just that we have much more robust predictive data now for those initial eight visits.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, another question about algorithms and feedback. Let's see. I think this is the one that you kind of were getting at before. Why they're asking, why aren't clients considered at risk as well if they score well above the green, so that their score is very high? So client Z has an improvement of 22 points, making it highly prone to fall back down. Maybe I'm thinking of the previous version, where we would want the ORS to stay ideally between the 50th and 75th percentile. And then he goes on to say, recently he was talking to you about a case with our current algorithms, and that we were thinking the ORS trajectories that exceeded the 75th percentile, these were cases that were unstable and unlikely to succeed. So he's saying it's not just getting about the 50th percentile. I mean, and I'm saying this because, of course, we're talking about the old system, and again, you know, translating that into the new system. So I guess the question is really, you know, should we be concerned about people who have whose scores go up very high? And should the system be giving us a signal that tells us that?
Here again, we're learning a great deal. What I can tell you is, if the client scores are in the green zone at any given session, that those scores are predictive of eventual success, and you should treat it that way. At the same time, and we've learned since the initial algorithms were formed that there is a large group of clients who experience dramatic early improvement and do not experience a decline after that dramatic improvement. So they might start, like this particular graph does, at about an 18, they improve to a 35, let's say, in the second visit. The question is, is that predictive of success? Yes, much better predictive of success than had they gone in the opposite direction by the same amount. At the same time, it's good clinical practice to say to the client who experiences those dramatic changes, let's prepare in case it isn't maintained. You don't lose anything by preparing the client. Only two things can happen when the scores go up that dramatic way. They can either stay up or they can go down. If you prepare the client by saying what might make it go down, what could you anticipate might give you a run for your money, and it doesn't go down, oh well, you were wrong. If it does go down, well then you're a prophet, and the engagement will be all that much greater. The client will be paying attention, so you lose nothing by preparing the client, but that is more about good clinical practice. Again, the appropriate comparison would be, let's say the client scores decline by that same amount and you're in the red zone. At that particular point, you can be sure that if you don't do something for that client, that the likelihood of them ending unsuccessfully is significant.
Right, good. Okay, so those were my questions from our super users and comments. So now I'm switching over to the questions, and I'm just scrolling down. I think you can see these too, Scott, but I'll just go ahead and I'll just find some. So can you show a screenshot of the new stats? So the problem is, this is the new stats page. I mean, it's the aggregate stats page. I'm not sure specifically. Let's see. Can you repeat the 3 items that will be deleted? Average, raw change. Okay. So I think that what they want to know, Scott, is you've explained why it's not important. They still liked it. So how do they? What it is yeah, but it's too nuanced. They glaze over when you start talking about. So really, wouldn't it be that instead of talking about average raw change, that we would just use a scatter plot? Would that not be a good way, a simple way for them to be looking at their clients?
Yeah. I think that we initially thought, I initially thought, and we initially based the old algorithms, and they were based to the end until this new edition of my outcomes with the performance metric algorithms in them. They were based on average amount of change per client. And the problem with that is it communicates nothing about the individual case. And so in place of that, you get the scatter plot, which tells you at a given session, are your clients on track or off track? And what we mean by that is their current score at that particular session is predictive of either a positive, negative, or indeterminate outcome. There's no guessing here that needs to be done.
That's right, and and that's the whole reason that we're getting rid of it, is because it just, the index was a good start, right? Yeah. Average raw change, they're a good start, but they're not really as meaningful. They might be simple, but they're not as meaningful as
they actually now, they really do lead to a misunderstanding about how much change is success. And the whole idea of using the reliable change index, which was a very good idea at the time, the problem with it is, and I hope I'm not glossing over this too glibly, the problem with the reliable change index is that it provides an average amount of change that is applied across all clients, regardless of the client's level of distress at intake. So whether a client is at a 5 on the intake or a 25, the reliable change index is static. It stays the same. Well, how could that be? A person at 5 needs to experience much more benefit from therapy for it to be reliable than a person who scores a 25. And yet that's the way the system was operating, because we didn't really know how else to do it, number one. And more importantly, we didn't have enough clients to make predictions that were reliable on an individual case-by-case basis.
Yeah. And average raw change, well, simple. It's based on that reliable change index, giving us something meaningful, which, like you said, it was a good start. But yeah, today, we've got better ways of identifying, what's success, what's failure, and and what does change mean, basically.
And for the individual client, meaning we have much better ways of telling for the individual client. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this person is asking, is there a way to plot the individual scales of a session? No, there's not, but we do have underneath the client status graph, underneath down here, compare past session data. You can go down and you can look at multiple sessions and look at the subscale scores side by side. That's as far as we've gotten with that. And is there any data to suggest that changes to the individual subscales predicts outcomes? And before I get you to answer, Scott, I'm going to say it's part of the reason we don't plot the subscales.
Yeah, the only score on the ORS that's predictive is the total score. So let's distinguish between predictive utility and clinical utility. When we're plotting the client score and trying to ask, are they progressing like people who eventually end successfully, then you have to use the total score. However, if you're working with the individual person in your practice and they're not progressing, for example, this particular client that you're showing now, Cindy, at session 6 has a score of about 19 or 20. And you're wanting to know, well, what am I missing? One thing I might immediately go do is look at the individual subscales and try to see if there's not something clinically useful that I can dig out of that. For example, a score of 19 or 20 could mean that a client has 8s on two of the scales and a 2 on 2 of the scales. And I might want to focus on those 2 2s rather than the 2 8s. So that gives me something clinically useful, but it doesn't have predictive utility.
Great, exactly. Okay, this is a good question. The information about expected treatment response seems to be mainly adult focused. Is there the same client base for predicting the expected treatment response of children and young people?
Yes.
Yes. Is that your answer?
That's my final answer.
So, basically, Scott, is that the algorithms that we used to have separate algorithms for children and adults.
Yeah.
But what we found is that other than the clinical cutoff, the responses are similar, not significantly different.
They're not significantly different nor predictive of success, which is again really critical in terms of the difference between prior iterations and this one. And let me just say one other thing while we're on the subject of cultural differences. And I view kids as coming from a different culture than the people who treat them. We've also made some comparisons of various countries, for example, Scandinavia compared to North America, and countries within the European Union to other countries in the European Union and to the United States and Canada. And we don't see any differences either. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't cultural differences. It just means that we're using huge numbers here, and also a measure that, is 4 items in length. And because of those things, those small differences have evened out.
Great. Okay, so next question. Could you clarify when these new changes will take place? They will take place Friday night. The site will be down for 3 to 6 hours. It's a huge change in the database. So we've picked that time because it's a time that is used the least by our users around the world. And next one, we have young children's ORS, but there is no way to record to plot it. Why is that, Scott?
As I often say in workshops, the scale might be useful for engaging children, but getting reliable scores from people that young with a 4-item measure is just nearly impossible. That's one answer. The second answer is most of those young kids are not there because they chose to go there, but rather because someone else is concerned. And so in that particular case, it's really important to get the collaterals score. And now I know some people might be doing things like sand play and other therapies that are truly aimed at young children. But here again, it is often left to either to the therapist to determine whether or not the client is making progress in that case. We would say it's really important that the stakeholders in those young children's lives agree that progress is being made, and therefore you would want to use one of the other measures to seek a collateral rating of that child.
Okay, that's great, Scott. Thanks. That's it. It's gone back to the beginning on me. Any more questions? That was the last question I had.
I can say one thing, Cynthia, that for me, the change in these algorithms from very static plots of median responses, where we're just taking the average and plotting the average client progress from a given point, to these predictive algorithms, is the difference between, say, a standard mobile phone, a flip phone, the clamshell phones from the late 1990s, to the iPhone. This is the quantum leap that's taking place. It does take some getting used to in order to think differently about what the graph is showing you. For example, there is no median line 25th and 50th percentile. You're being shown, is the client progressing like successful people or not? But at the same time, once you have an iPhone, you're not going to want to go back to the old clamshell push button thing. Its utility is so limited. This is really giving us, for the first time, a sense of whether or not our clients are on track for success.
Great. Okay, Scott. Oh, look, what do we got here? Oh, what about the reliability of the kids' SRS score in terms of reliability, validity?
I'm not sure what the question means. Is it reliable?
Yeah, I guess it comes out of the question. We were just talking about the young children's ORS, and so they're
Young
questioning.
children, that's one thing. Again,
Yes.
it's the same thing. There aren't any reliability or validity studies with the young child versions of either scale. What I can tell you is that the children's SRS is the subject of two studies that we've done, where we show, in fact, that improving SRS scores lead to better outcomes. So that would be with kids from, 13 to 18 years old. So with the children's version of the SRS, very reliable and also highly correlated with better outcomes when the SRS scores are improving.
Right. That makes sense, right? And someone is asking about My Outcomes UK, which is a UK implementation of My Outcomes, and it actually is live right now. You can go to the site and sign up for a trial. And we got one more here. No, that was that same reliability, validity one. Okay, so that is it, Scott. That's a wrap. Last chance, anyone else has a question? The page I'm on, this is My Outcomes Advanced Behavioral Algorithms page. There will be a copy of the webinar available on this page, benchmarking report. So all updates related to this release will be available on this page. And if you have questions, you certainly can contact your customer service rep or myself, or there's also Ask a Question right here on this page. And we look forward to your feedback once everybody gets into the new system next week. And I wanted to thank you, Scott, for taking the time to meet with us and go over these exciting changes. And I know there'll be some growing pains for some people, but I hope that, and I'm pretty confident that everybody's going to be happier with the new system. All right.
I'm very confident too about that, Cindy, and I'm grateful that My Outcomes has gone to the extensive effort it has to incorporate these new outcomes and all the support in their system so that clinicians can better know whether the people they're working with are on track or not.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everybody, for attending.